I never expected that a catastrophic plumbing failure would change my life, but that's exactly what happened. It's funny, isn't it? You spend so much time curating your existence, building these neat, quiet little walls around yourself, only to have a burst pipe wash them all away. And in the wreckage, you find something you didn't even know you were looking for. My name is Lucas. At the time, I was 28 and worked as a freelance editor from my small, one-bedroom apartment. My life ran on a predictable schedule: coffee, manuscripts, a walk in the late afternoon, dinner for one, and a book before bed. It wasn't a bad life, not by any means, but it was a solitary one. I had friends, of course, but my day-to-day existence was a quiet loop of my own making. I was comfortable in my solitude, or at least, I had convinced myself I was. My apartment was on the third floor of a pre-war building, the kind with stubborn radiators and floors that groaned with stories. It had character, which was a polite way of saying it was old and occasionally fell apart. The walls were thin enough that I knew my neighbor Mrs. Gable watched game shows every afternoon, and the couple below had arguments about recycling every Tuesday night. I was a quiet observer of this little ecosystem, a ghost in its hallways. Then Caleb moved into 3B, the apartment directly across the hall. The moving day itself was an event. I watched through my peephole, a habit I'm not proud of, as he and a friend hauled a heavy-looking sofa up 3 flights of stairs. He was tall, with broad shoulders and arms that showed the clear, defined results of hard work. He wore a simple gray t-shirt, dark with sweat, and his dusty brown hair was constantly being pushed back from his forehead. He laughed easily, a deep, warm sound that carried down the hallway and seemed to vibrate right through my door. From my limited observations, Caleb was everything I wasn't. He seemed effortlessly confident, grounded in his own skin. I learned he worked in construction, leaving early in the morning in steel-toed boots and coming home covered in a fine layer of dust, smelling faintly of sawdust and the outdoors. He was friendly in the way truly outgoing people are. He'd offer a "morning, man," if we passed on the stairs, or a "have a good one," if we collected our mail at the same time. I'd usually just manage a tight smile and a quiet "you too" before scurrying back into my apartment, my heart doing a strange little flutter. He was handsome in a rugged, unassuming way that made my throat feel tight. He was, I was certain, completely and utterly straight. He was a beautiful, unattainable fixture in my hallway, a brief flash of warmth in my quiet, beige life. For weeks, this was our dynamic. Brief, pleasant encounters that left me overthinking for hours. I'd analyze the way he smiled, the crinkles that formed at the corners of his eyes. Was it just politeness, or was there something more? I always concluded it was just politeness. Guys like Caleb were nice to everyone. It didn't mean anything. It was safer to believe it meant nothing. I kept him at a distance, a character in the story of my building rather than a person in the story of my life. It was a Wednesday night when my curated world literally fell apart. I was sitting at my desk, trying to untangle a particularly messy paragraph for a client, when I heard a strange groaning sound from inside the wall. It was followed by a faint hiss, like a snake trapped in the plaster. I pressed my ear against the paint, confused. The hissing grew louder, and then came a dark, spreading stain on the wallpaper just above the baseboard. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. I stared as the stain grew, a monstrous, watery bloom. A trickle became a stream, and then water began to seep out from under the baseboard, pooling on my hardwood floors. My mind went blank for a second before kicking into high gear. I grabbed towels, throwing them down uselessly as the flow increased. It wasn't just a leak, it was a deluge. I ran into the hallway, my mind racing. Landlord, I needed to call the landlord. My phone was on my desk, right next to the expanding puddle. As I turned back, my door, which I'd left ajar, was pushed open wider. Caleb stood there, his brow furrowed with concern. He must have heard the commotion. "Everything okay, man?" he asked, his eyes going from my panicked face to the water now creeping over the threshold into the hall. "Whoa, that is not okay. The wall," I stammered, pointing like a fool. "It just started." He didn't hesitate. He was inside my apartment in 2 strides, his work boots sloshing through the inch of water. He surveyed the scene with a calm, practiced eye that immediately made me feel like a helpless child. "Okay," he said, his voice steady. "We need to find the water main shut off for this line." It's probably in the basement. He looked at me. Call the landlord. What's his name? Mr. Henderson. I'll go kill the water. And just like that, he was gone, taking the stairs two at a time. I stood there, ankle deep in lukewarm water, watching him go. He was a man of action, a man who saw a problem and immediately knew how to start fixing it. I, on the other hand, was a man who stared at a problem until it became a flood. I finally snapped out of it and fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed. By the time Mr. Henderson arrived, looking frazzled and old, Caleb had already shut off the water. The torrent had slowed to a miserable drip. The damage, however, was done. My living room was a shallow lake. My favorite rug was a soggy, ruined mess, and the legs of my bookshelf were already starting to swell. Mr. Henderson wrung his hands and muttered about old pipes and insurance. It's the main riser for the whole line, he said, poking at the damp wall. It's going to take a few days to get a plumber in here to tear this open and replace it. And then the floors and the drywall. Son, you can't stay here. The words hit me like a physical blow. Can't stay here? Where was I supposed to go? All my friends lived across town, and the thought of imposing on them, of disrupting their lives, filled me with a familiar dread. I hated being a burden. I just stood there, staring at the destruction of my sanctuary, feeling utterly adrift. It was Caleb who spoke up. He'd been standing quietly by the door, observing. He can stay with me, he said, so simply and directly that it took me a second to process the words. Both Mr. Henderson and I turned to look at him. I've got a spare room. It's just full of junk, but I can clear it out. It's no trouble. I opened my mouth to protest, to say that it was too much, that I couldn't possibly impose. I was a stranger, really, a neighbor he barely knew. But the look on his face wasn't one of pity. It was one of genuine, uncomplicated kindness. He saw someone in a tough spot and offered a solution. There was no hesitation in his offer, no awkwardness. Are you sure? Mr. Henderson asked, his relief palpable. Yeah, of course, Caleb said, his eyes on me. We're neighbors, right? That's what you do. And so, with a duffel bag full of clothes, my laptop, and a profound sense of unreality, I moved across the hall. I left behind the quiet, predictable world I had built, a world that was now waterlogged and ruined, and stepped into Caleb's. The door to apartment 3B closed behind me, and a new, terrifying, and exhilarating chapter of my life began. Caleb's apartment was a mirror image of mine in layout, but in every other way, it was a different universe. Where mine was neat, neutral, and impersonal, his was lived in and warm. The walls were a deep, calming blue, and they were covered in framed blueprints and architectural sketches. A sturdy wooden coffee table he'd clearly built himself sat in the center of the room, and a guitar leaned against a well-worn armchair. It smelled like coffee and cedar. It smelled like him. Sorry about the mess, he said, though it wasn't messy at all, just comfortably cluttered. The spare room is through here. Let me just move some of this stuff. The room was small, but it had a large window that looked out onto the same leafy street as mine. He quickly and efficiently moved boxes of tools and stacked lumber against one wall, revealing a simple bed with a metal frame. He found clean sheets in a closet and made the bed with a swift, practiced economy of motion that I found mesmerizing to watch. There, he said, smoothing the quilt. It's not the Hilton, but it's dry. He gave me a small, reassuring smile. Make yourself at home, Lucas. Seriously. Kitchen's yours, TV's yours. Whatever you need. That first night was strange. I lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of a different apartment. I could hear Caleb moving around in the living room, the soft strum of his guitar, the low murmur of the television. These were the sounds of another person's life, a life that was suddenly and intimately tangled with my own. I was intensely aware of him, just a wall away. It was a proximity that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. My anxiety was a live wire in my chest, but underneath it, a tiny, hopeful seedling was starting to unfurl. The next few days settled into a new, unexpected routine. I'd wake up to the smell of coffee brewing. Caleb was an early riser, and he always made enough for two. I'd emerge from the spare room to find a mug waiting for me on the counter. We'd drink our coffee in a comfortable silence, the morning light streaming through the kitchen window. He'd tell me about the construction site he was heading to, and I'd tell him about the book I was editing. Must be cool, he said one morning, leaning against the counter. Just reading all day. It's mostly just correcting grammar and yelling at my computer screen, I admitted with a self-deprecating laugh. It's not as romantic as it sounds. Still, he said, his gaze thoughtful. You're working with stories. That's cool. He looked down at his own hands, which were calloused and capable. I just build the boxes the stories happen in. It was the first time I'd seen a crack in his confident exterior. It wasn't a complaint, just a quiet observation that hinted at something deeper. It was a side of him I never would have seen in our 30-second hallway encounters. I found myself wanting to know more about the man who thought of buildings as boxes for stories. In the evenings, he'd come home, tired and dusty, and drop his boots by the door. Some nights he'd cook. He was a surprisingly good cook, making simple, hearty meals like chili or pasta. We'd eat at his small dining table, and he'd ask me about my day. He was a good listener, attentive and engaged. He'd nod in all the right places and ask questions that showed he was actually paying attention. One evening, after dinner, I saw him sketching in a worn notebook while we were half watching some documentary on television. He seemed so absorbed that I didn't think he'd notice me looking, but he glanced up and caught my eye. A faint blush crept up his neck, and he quickly closed the book. Sorry, I said reflexively. I didn't mean to stare. It's nothing, he muttered, tucking the notebook beside the couch cushion. Just messing around, but my curiosity was piqued. The next day, while he was at work, I couldn't resist. My guilt warred with my intrigue, and intrigue won. I picked up the notebook. I told myself I'd just look at one page. I opened it carefully, and my breath caught. It was filled with the most beautiful, intricate drawings of buildings. But they weren't like the blueprints on his walls. These were fantastical structures, houses that grew out of trees, cities that floated on clouds, libraries with spiraling towers that seemed to pierce the sky. They were imaginative and full of a strange, delicate beauty. He wasn't just building boxes. He was dreaming of castles. This was his vulnerability, the secret he kept tucked away in a spiral-bound notebook. This was the thoughtful, artistic soul hiding beneath the tool belt and the easy smile. And seeing it made the fluttering in my chest intensify, transforming from a simple crush into something deeper, something more resonant and real. I felt like I had been given a glimpse into his truest self. That night, I decided to cook for him as a thank you. I made my one specialty, a ridiculously complicated lasagna that took me 3 hours. When Caleb got home, the apartment was filled with the smell of garlic and tomatoes. He stopped dead in the doorway, a look of surprise on his face. Wow, he said, inhaling deeply. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to. I said, my cheeks feeling warm. It's the least I can do for you letting me crash here and saving me from a flood. We ate dinner, and the conversation felt easier than ever. I felt emboldened by my secret knowledge of his drawings. I wanted him to know that I saw him, the real him. I saw your drawings, I confessed, my heart hammering. I'm sorry, I was nosy, but I saw your sketchbook on the couch. They're incredible, Caleb. Really. He froze, a forkful of lasagna halfway to his mouth. The blush I'd seen before returned, darker this time. He looked down at his plate, and for a moment, I thought I had made a terrible mistake, that I had overstepped a boundary I didn't know existed. They're just dumb sketches, he said quietly. No, they're not. I insisted, my voice soft but firm. They're architectural poetry. You have a real gift. He finally looked up, and his eyes were full of a raw, startling vulnerability. He held my gaze for a long moment, and it felt like the air in the room had suddenly become thick and charged. It was a look that communicated more than words ever could. It was gratitude, surprise, and something else. Something I was too afraid to name. We were washing the dishes together later, standing side by side at the small sink. Our shoulders brushed, and an electric current shot through me. I moved away slightly, my nerves jangling. He must have felt it too, because the easy quiet between us was suddenly filled with a humming tension. We finished in silence, each of us hyper-aware of the other's every movement. A few days later, Mr. Henderson called to say my apartment was finally ready. The plumbers had finished, the drywall was patched, and the new flooring was in. The news should have made me happy. I was getting my home back, my routine, my quiet life. Instead, a leaden weight settled in my stomach. The thought of moving back across the hall, of returning to our brief, polite greetings, was unbearable. I had gotten used to the smell of Caleb's coffee in the morning the sound of his guitar at night. I had gotten used to him. I spent the afternoon moving my things back. Caleb helped, of course. He carried the boxes of books that I couldn't manage, his muscles flexing under his t-shirt. It was all done in less than an hour. My apartment was clean and smelled of new paint and wood varnish. It was also sterile and empty and silent. Well, I said, standing awkwardly in my own living room. I guess that's everything. The finality of it hung in the air. Looks good, he said, his voice a little strained. The new floor is nice. He was avoiding my eyes. Thank you, I said, my voice barely a whisper. For everything, Caleb. I don't know what I would have done. It was nothing, he said, finally meeting my gaze. Like I said, we're neighbors. The word neighbors sounded like a demotion now. It felt like a door swinging shut. I wanted to say more, to tell him how much it meant to me, how much I would miss our evenings, how much I would miss him. But the words were caught in my throat, tangled in a web of fear and uncertainty. What if I had misread everything? What if his kindness was just that, kindness? He walked me to my door. It was a ridiculous gesture, a journey of maybe 15 feet from my living room to my front door, a door that led to a hallway that separated me from him by another 10 feet. It was a formality, a polite way to end the evening, to end my stay. I reached for the doorknob, preparing to say a final goodnight. But as my hand closed around the cool metal, he moved. It was a small, quick motion. He didn't grab my arm or my shoulder. He reached out and hooked a single finger into the belt loop on the side of my jeans. It was such a strange, intimate gesture. His finger was warm against the fabric, a tiny point of contact that sent a shock wave through my entire body. He tugged gently, just enough to stop me from turning the knob, just enough to keep me there, facing him. I froze, my back still to him. My heart was a trapped bird, beating frantically against my ribs. I couldn't breathe. What was happening? The silence stretched, filled with the unspoken question that his touch had just asked. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, his finger hooked in my belt loop, holding me in place. It wasn't forceful, it was a plea. A quiet, desperate, don't go. Slowly, every muscle in my body screaming with tension, I turned my head to look at him over my shoulder. His face was a mask of conflicting emotions. There was nervousness there, a deep uncertainty, but his eyes were full of a burning intensity that I had only glimpsed before. He was looking at me as if he was trying to memorize every feature of my face. Caleb, I whispered, my voice trembling. He swallowed hard, and his finger tightened ever so slightly on my belt loop. He seemed to be fighting a war within himself. Then, as quickly as he had done it, he let go. He took a step back, breaking the spell. The warmth of his touch vanished, leaving a cold spot in its place. Good night, Lucas, he mumbled, his gaze fixed on the floor. He turned and practically fled back to his own apartment, the door closing behind him with a soft, definitive click. I stood there for I don't know how long, my hand still on the doorknob, staring at his closed door. I could still feel the phantom pressure of his finger on my hip. My entire world had just tilted on its axis. The ambiguity was gone. That wasn't the gesture of a kind neighbor. That was something else entirely. And the aftermath of that realization, the terrifying, exhilarating, heart-stopping possibility of it, left me breathless. The days that followed were a special kind of torture. I was back in my own apartment, my own routine, but everything was different. The silence was no longer comfortable. It was deafening. My apartment didn't feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a cage. Every creak in the hallway, every footstep outside my door, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I'd rush to the peephole, my heart pounding, hoping to see him, and at the same time, dreading it. We entered a new phase of our neighborly relationship, the great avoidance. If I heard his door open, I'd wait until I heard it close before leaving. If I saw him coming down the stairs, I'd pretend I forgot something and duck back inside. We saw each other once, by the mailboxes. It was excruciating. We both muttered a hey, and then stared intently at our junk mail, as if it contained the secrets of the universe. The easy camaraderie we had built was gone, replaced by a thick, shimmering wall of tension. My mind became a relentless replay machine. The belt loop incident. Over and over again, I analyzed it from every angle. It was the central piece of evidence in a trial happening entirely inside my head. The prosecution argued it was a fluke, a weird, impulsive gesture he immediately regretted. Maybe he'd been drinking. Maybe it was just a clumsy, awkward way of saying goodbye. The fear of rejection, of humiliation, was a powerful advocate for this theory. Making a move and being wrong would be devastating. It would shatter the fragile hope I'd been nursing and make living across the hall from him impossible. But the defense, fueled by a desperate, stubborn hope, had a stronger case. I replayed the look in his eyes when I complimented his drawings. I replayed the way our shoulders brushed at the sink. And most of all, I replayed the look on his face in the doorway, that raw, uncertain vulnerability. The way he had held me there, not with force, but with a silent plea. It wasn't an accident. It couldn't have been. It felt intentional. It felt like a question he didn't know how to ask out loud. Was it possible? Could a guy like Caleb, a guy who seemed so confident and grounded, who worked with his hands and smelled like sawdust, be interested in me? Me, the quiet, anxious editor who lived inside his own head and whose biggest adventure was trying a new brand of tea. The idea seemed preposterous. And yet, the evidence was there. The small moments had added up, culminating in that one, undeniable touch. I was trapped in a state of suspended animation, caught between the terror of being wrong and the agony of not knowing. The space between our two doors had become a charged, impassable territory. It was only 10 feet of hallway, but it felt like a canyon. I knew that one of us had to be brave enough to cross it, and I was terrified that it was going to have to be me. I spent 2 full days agonizing over what to do. I wrote and deleted a dozen text messages. I paced my newly floored living room until I was sure I was wearing a groove in it. I was losing my mind. This limbo was worse than an outright rejection. I had to know. I decided that if I saw him next, I would just say something. Anything. I'd ask him to get a coffee, a beer, something outside the charged confines of our hallway. I practiced the words in the mirror until they sounded less like a plea for my life and more like a casual invitation. But I didn't have to. On the 3rd night after the incident, just as I was resigning myself to another evening of anxious pacing, there was a knock on my door. It wasn't a loud, confident knock. It was soft, hesitant. I knew instantly it was him. My heart leaped into my throat. I smoothed my shirt down, took a deep, shaky breath, and opened the door. Caleb stood there, looking more nervous than I had ever seen him. He wasn't wearing his work clothes. He had on a clean, dark sweater, and his hair was still slightly damp from a shower. He was fidgeting with the hem of his sleeve, and he wouldn't meet my eyes. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "Hey," I replied, my own voice sounding thin and reedy. An awkward silence fell between us. The air in the hallway crackled with everything left unsaid. He was the one who had come here, but he seemed completely at a loss for words. Can we talk for a minute?" He finally managed, his eyes still fixed on a spot somewhere over my shoulder. "Of course," I said, stepping back to let him in. "Come in." He walked into my apartment and stood in the middle of the living room, looking around as if he'd never seen it before. He seemed out of place, a lion in a canary cage. I closed the door, the soft click echoing in the silent room. My hands were sweating. This was it. The verdict was about to be read. He finally turned to face me, and he looked miserable. "Look, Lucas," he started, his voice strained. I need to apologize. For the other night. At the door. That was weird. It was out of line, and I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable." My heart sank. So that was it. The prosecution had been right. It was a mistake, a weird impulse he regretted. The hope I had been clinging to dissolved, replaced by a dull, aching disappointment. I tried to arrange my face into a mask of casual understanding. "It's okay," I said, the words tasting like ash. "Don't worry about it." "No, it's not okay," he insisted, finally looking me in the eye. And what I saw there wasn't regret. It was panic. It was a desperate fear that I had misunderstood. That's not what I mean. I'm not sorry I did it. I'm sorry for how I did it. I'm sorry I freaked out and ran away. I'm not good at this." He took a shaky breath and ran a hand through his damp hair. "I've been trying to figure out how to talk to you for weeks. Since the day I moved in, if I'm being honest. You just seemed, I don't know. You have this quiet thing about you that I really liked. But I didn't know how to approach you. I thought you probably weren't. You know," he gestured vaguely between us. "Interested." I just stared at him, my brain struggling to catch up. He'd been interested? Since the beginning. "And then your place flooded," he continued, a humorless laugh escaping his lips. And it felt like some kind of sign, like the universe was giving me a chance. And having you here, across the hall, it was really nice, Lucas. I liked having you here. A lot. Too much, probably. He paused, gathering his courage. When you were leaving, I just panicked. I didn't want you to go back to your apartment, and for us to go back to just being guys who say hey in the hallway. I wanted more than that. And I did the first stupid, impulsive thing that came into my head. I just wanted to keep you there for one more second. And then I got scared and ran, which was even stupider. He finally fell silent, his confession hanging in the air between us. He looked at me, his eyes wide with vulnerability, waiting for my response. My own disappointment had vanished, replaced by a soaring, brilliant wave of relief and joy so intense it almost made me dizzy. He felt it too. All this time, he had been just as uncertain, just as scared as I was. I found my voice, and when I spoke, it was clear and steady. I'm not good at this either, Caleb, I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. And for the record, I didn't want to go. The tension in his shoulders visibly eased. A look of profound relief washed over his features, followed by a shy, hopeful smile of his own. The canyon between us was gone. He took a hesitant step toward me. So he said softly, "Can I try that again? The part at the door? But, do it better this time." I laughed, a real, genuine laugh. "Yeah," I said. "I think you can." He closed the distance between us in a single step. He didn't hook his finger in my belt loop this time. Instead, he gently cupped my face in his big, warm, calloused hands. He looked into my eyes, and there was no fear left, no uncertainty. There was only a clear, beautiful, undeniable truth. And then he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't a clumsy, hesitant kiss. It was confident and sure, full of all the words we had been too afraid to say. It was an apology and a confession and a promise all at once. And I kissed him back, pouring all of my own hope and relief and longing into it. In the middle of my clean, quiet, sterile apartment, everything finally burst into color. The weeks that followed felt like waking up from a long, gray dream. We didn't have to navigate the awkwardness of a first date. We had already lived together. We skipped the small talk and went straight to the heart of things. We went to dinner at a small Italian place downtown and talked for hours. He told me about his dream of one day designing and building his own fantastical houses, not just working on other people's projects. I told him about the novel I had been secretly writing for years, the one I had never let anyone else read. He read it, the whole thing. He sat on my couch for an entire weekend and read every word. And when he was done, he looked at me with an expression of such genuine admiration that it made my heart ache in the best possible way. "It's beautiful, Lucas," he'd said. "You're a storyteller." My apartment no longer felt empty. It became our space. His guitar found a home in the corner of my living room. His sketchbook lived on my coffee table, open for me to see whenever I wanted. My life was no longer a quiet, predictable loop. It was filled with the sound of his laughter, the smell of his coffee, the comfortable weight of his presence next to me on the couch. The 10 feet of hallway between our doors became a well-worn path. One evening, a couple of months later, we were coming back from a movie. We walked up the 3 flights of stairs, our hands linked together. When we reached our floor, he walked me to my door, just as he had all those weeks ago. I stopped and turned to face him, a playful smile on my lips. "Well, good night," I said, teasing him. He smiled back, the familiar crinkles forming at the corners of his eyes. He leaned in and gave me a soft, lingering kiss. Then, he reached out and playfully hooked his thumb into my belt loop, just like he had that first time. But this time, there was no panic, no hesitation. He used it to gently pull me closer, until my body was flush against his. "You're not getting away that easy," he murmured against my lips, before kissing me again, deeply and thoroughly, right there in the hallway. It's amazing, really, how your entire world can change in an instant. For me, it was a burst pipe, a flooded floor, and the kindness of a neighbor I was too afraid to talk to. I had built my life around emotional safety, keeping everyone and everything at a careful distance. I thought that was strength. But Caleb taught me something different. He taught me that real strength is about vulnerability, about daring to cross the hallway, about reaching out and holding on, even if it's just by a single belt loop. He washed away my old world and helped me build a new one, a better one, together. And I can tell you, the foundation is solid as a rock.